Good afternoon to everyone. I hope this is an interesting subject for a Saturday afternoon. It's certainly a favorite for me because I think investigation interviews helps to sort of conclude or um, tie up loose ends after an investigation. And although a lot of people attach sometimes less importance to it, I've personally found that with a little bit of planning and focus, it does help to conclude our projects to an effective end. Um, and from my experience, it is a very important segment of an investigation as well. So what I'd like to do today is share some theoretical concepts, but my idea is also to share with you my experiences with investigative interviews and how it has gone for me in the past. And because of the cyclone here, we don't have a wireless connection, which is why I'm going to be on the personal hotspot or mobile data. So I will share my screen, but just shut off the video now. Deepika, just a quick check. It's clear now, right? My audio and the presentation is also clear?
Loud and clear.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so the agenda for today's session is to just briefly give you an introduction as to what an investigative interview is, and also to take you through what happens before an interview, at the interview, and how we can apply some of these techniques in everyday life. I think the last part is also a little interesting because over the years, when I switched from internal audit to investigations, what invariably happened at a personal level also is that your method of communication changes. So depending on how people ask you certain questions and depending on what you'd like to share, you become very careful with words. So although the subject is about investigative interviews, I personally feel that it can be applied to any business context. It can be from a marketing perspective or a business growth perspective. It can even apply to internal audits, or even personal communication with different people. So I do hope that this is useful to all participants who are there today, because I think we have a mix of people from audit, people from investigations, and so on. I think towards the end, we have a Q&A session, and there is a chat box where the questions are to be posted, but I think we'll come to that in the end. So what are investigative interviews? It's primarily one method of gathering information. Usually it is applied at the last leg of an investigation. Now, normally as an investigation progresses, we step in to do the audit, a full physical examination of the documents, we study the facts, etc. However, there are always a lot of questions and clarifications which may be needed from either a witness or a suspect, which would probably help us to tie the loose ends together. So usually it happens at the last leg of an investigation, but it may not be at all cases towards the end, but mostly after every investigation, it is a good practice to have a set of interviews conducted towards the end so that any conclusions that we may draw based on the facts that are available to us through document review can be concluded, or we can tie up certain loose ends in a lot better manner with the help of the interviews. Normally interviews are verbal face-to-face, which means we do not send questions on email. We try to avoid doing interviews via web calls or online calls as well. Normally it is best to do it face-to-face, and there are multiple reasons for this. I think some of them we'll see as we move along. One of the main reasons is because during an investigative interview, it's not just about the words that are spoken between the two people, say the interviewer and the interviewee. It's also about the body language of the interviewee, which sometimes gives away a lot more clues than the words that are itself being used. So it's a good practice to normally do it as a verbal face-to-face meeting. There are different steps in an investigative interview, and any interview can go from simple to complex in a matter of minutes. So a best practice is always to ensure adequate time is invested in planning. So usually for me, if I know an interview is going to take about 2 hours, I'll easily spend 4 to 6 hours in planning. So the planning would take everything from who do we meet first, what time do we meet, where are we supposed to meet them, what type of questions do we ask. So there are various steps in planning, and we try to invest a lot of time in it so that the investigation does not go, the interview does not go out of control or out of hand. These are also sometimes one-shot meetings that you might get with a witness or suspect, and it's always best for us to it's always better to make the best of such meetings, and from that perspective, the planning really pays off. But apart from investigations, I think it can also be used in internal audit engagements, because at the end of it, it is about asking someone questions and getting the responses that we need to help us secure maybe additional evidence or to tie up loose ends. So before the interview, I've split the session into two parts. One is before the interview and at the interview. So before the interview, one of the first questions is, at what stage of investigation do we plan such a meeting? Now, usually this is to collect further evidence or to connect loose ends. It could also be to seek certain clarification where there are doubts, etc. Now, depending on who is to be interviewed, and it could be any of these three categories. The person we need to speak to could be a witness, they could be a suspect, or they could be a whistleblower. If an investigation has commenced on account of a whistleblower report, we normally keep the interview in the beginning and probably towards the end. But assuming the whistleblower part is out, if it's either a witness or a suspect, the investigation is conducted the interview is conducted either during the process or the progress of investigation or towards the end. In my experience, we normally keep it towards the end, except in some cases where we've had people voluntarily come up and say, I would like to share some information with you. Because although we don't disclose to the client that we are there for an investigation, we may tell them we're there for an internal audit or some kind of a review, and they could still come in. And I think sometimes people more or less get a sense that something is off, and that's why there is an auditor here coming to do a special review. So sometimes people do come up and say, okay, I'd like to share something with you, which means you'll have to do the interview on the fly, and that might be during the progress of investigation. Otherwise, in most cases, it's something that I've done towards the concluding stage. Preparation and planning for an interview is almost everything. One of the first things we try to arrive at is the location and the logistics part. Now, there are certain pros and cons of choosing different locations. You could either have the interview or the meeting at the client's location, but the disadvantage of that is that when you are meeting somebody for such a purpose, and there is an element of questioning involved, there could be a lot of chatter outside, and people might misunderstand the intent and so on. So it's always best to not keep it at the client's location. It is also not a good practice to keep it at the consultant's office, because that can tend to throw the person off guard as well. So normally what we try to do is either choose a neutral location, which could be the lawyer's office, or which also could be reason why somebody would be thrown off guard. But most of the times we try to keep the location neutral. It could be a hotel room, or it could be a conference room at any office facility, which is not usually the client's office or the consultant's office. We also try to plan the order of interviewees. And the reason for this is because, let's say you have to meet about 4 or 5 people in a given day, and let's say it starts with somebody at a mid-management level to someone at a senior level. There is a possibility that people who are there on that particular day could probably talk to each other and get themselves prepared by sharing that, this is the information that this is the question that they asked, and so on. So to try to limit that, it's very difficult to control it, but at least to try to limit it, what we normally tell the client is we ask them to schedule the time of interviews, and normally in terms of hierarchy, we go from junior most to senior most. We also request that the client organizes the transportation so that the person is picked up from their house or office and brought to the particular venue or location. So the other thing is you don't want all 4 of them or 5 of them to be in the same room at the same time waiting while you are calling each person for an interview, discussing with them, and then sending them back. The idea is to ensure that each person comes in, you communicate with them the questions that you need. The objective of that meeting is over, they go back and the next person comes in, and we try to limit as much as possible between 2 people who we are trying to speak to. We also try to plan the setting in terms of what should the seating arrangement be, who should be the interviewers and who the interviewees also should be. The people we'd be interviewing could be either a witness or a suspect. The type of questions will also differ a little bit depending on whether someone is a witness or a suspect. Interviewers could be 1 or 2, but there's always an additional person who is seated who might also have to take notes. So the seating position matters. We try to go there at least a day in advance and see whether the location is comfortable, sort of plan your seating arrangements, ensure there's water, beverages, so on and so forth. The representation part also matters because while earlier on during the course of review, as a consultant, you might have disclosed yourself as, let's say, an internal auditor, or you're there for a special review. From a legal perspective, it's very important to clearly explain that we are there to represent the client's company and we're not there to represent any individual on either side of the table. So the representation and the interviewee's understanding of the purpose and objective of the interview is very important, and that needs to be laid out initially. One of the key elements of an interview is also to plan the questions or the framework. So there's a detailed section on this which I'll come to later. And finally, the evidence. Now we ensure that the evidence copies are also available to support the questions, so that when you are at the meeting and let's say the interviewee asks you, can you give me proof of what you're saying, we should not be fumbling for the evidence and saying, okay, let me just check my laptop and see if I can pull it out, or let me go through the file. So normally what we do is we write down the list of questions, keep all the evidence on hand, whether it is on soft copy or hard copy, but keep everything linked to each question. One of the other key elements is interviews have to move at a certain pace and need to be completed within a time frame. So more time we give or more allowance is given for other administrative things during the session, what happens is the person is able to think, and therefore if there is an intent to, let's say, fabricate some of the evidence or maybe bring in an element of deceit, or just allowing the person to think a little bit. So while you do want the interviewee to be very comfortable and calm during the session, you don't want to give them too much time to think either. So from that perspective, it's very important to keep all the evidence readily available so that no time is wasted on anything else. Now, drafting questions is what takes up a lot of time. And this is one aspect I feel, if you invest adequate time and you do a brainstorming session just before the interview, then the success of the interview usually is 100%. I have found that when there is no planning done for an interview, then you're very readily set to fail that particular meeting. So normally what we do before we draft the questions is we try to read the entire report. As you read the report, we try to list down what doubts we have, what questions come up, what are the loose ends that need to be tied up. So with that, the objectives of meeting each person and the objective of each interview can be very, very clearly defined or finalized. Now, sometimes while the ideal outcome of an interview might be to seek additional evidence, sometimes it may not always be possible. Like I remember there was this one interview with a senior person, and he had colluded with the CEO of the US company in setting up shop in India, and there was a lot of legal violation, because I think the legal requirements for registration of that particular business was highly complex. So this gentleman had helped the founder in the US with setting up shop in India, but by flouting a lot of the rules and norms and regulations. So when we did that interview, we were told upfront that it could be very aggressive and that he may not be forthcoming with information. So although we went for this interview knowing that the objective was to get the entire story from him, we told the client that if he refuses to talk to us, we said we'll at least get him to agree to speak to somebody within the company. Because what happens with interviewing certain senior management personnel is they become a little wary of you because you are still someone who's outside the company. So all we said was, if we are not able to get those responses from him, we will at least get him to agree to meeting the client directly and then sharing whatever was needed, because up until that point, he was even denying any meeting requests with the client. So sometimes it helps to have a primary objective and a secondary objective so that all is not lost, but at least it helps the investigation to progress to the next step. So in this particular case, that's exactly what happened, because the man became very a little aggressive, and he could have very easily turned a hostile witness as well. But I think as the meeting progressed, we just kept pushing and saying, okay, if you're not willing to share that information with us, and we are aware, or here is the evidence of all that's transpired. And so finally, at the end of it, we got him to agree to meet the COO of the company, and that meeting was scheduled, and finally the investigation progressed. So as far as the secondary objective of that interview went, it was still a success for us. The main aspect is to draft questions or build a framework. Now, I know this is more about personal preference. Some investigators prefer to draft questions in complete sentences and at a very detailed level. Personally, I'm in favor of this method. Some other investigators who I also know of tend to have a structure or a framework, which will just have certain compartments of information that has to be shared with the interviewee, and they keep it a little loose, so that I think the idea of the second method is to keep the flow of the conversation, and they structure the questions as the interview progresses. With the first method, what I have personally found is that your basic questions are already in place, so your focus is present and clear. And based on the responses, if you need to change the questions, you can always do that. But your basic structure is in place. So once the questions are drafted, the next step is to link it with the evidence or the report. And for this, it can either be in hard copy or soft copy. So for every section in the framework or for every question, we try to connect it with an actual number in, you actually create a folder itself and then number all the evidences 1, 2, 3, 4 and connect them with the questions, or you keep printed copies of all the evidence. Usually we do a brainstorming session with the client so that we come up with scenarios saying, okay, and mostly the client will be aware of the personalities of the people we're trying to interview. So if you know someone's a little aggressive, then you have to be better prepared for the type of responses that might come up. So brainstorming with the client also really helps. So I think usually if you have an interview going for about a day, then the planning and the brainstorming session could easily be about 1.5 to 2 days. So I think the key element is just in the preparation, and the better prepared we are for an interview, the control and flow of conversation is a lot better. Now, as far as drafting or building those questions go, usually what is followed by any industry, or it can be either in journalism or it can be in even for our investigative interviews, most of the questions will follow a funnel approach, which is a top-down approach, wherein you have a lot of open-ended questions on top, very generic questions on top, wherein you might start with, let's say, the introduction. You might start about talking about the business itself, and then as you come down, you'll narrow down the questions maybe to a specific process, and then maybe it could come down to the specific instances or exceptions identified, and that's where you can add more probing questions and finally come to the conclusion. Good practice is to avoid multi-part questions, because when you put two questions in one, it confuses the listener, and they either answer one part of the question or the other, or leave out both. So avoid multi-part questions so that the question is very clear. We also avoid accusatory questions. The whole idea of an interview is to be very fair and neutral to both sides. So we don't approach with either accusatory or leading questions, and we also tend to avoid yes or no questions. So mostly probing questions are used, and the idea is to get the other person to open up and share what they can in a comfortable space. So if we were to look at the question funnel, right on top, we'd have the wide open questions. And then as you can see, you have the open-ended questions, focused questions, probing questions, and then it comes down to something more conclusive. So this is where we can say, okay, in summary, this is what you've told us. So is this correct? Do you agree to X, Y, Z? And conclude the interview. I have an example of a good interview and a bad interview also after the next section. So the detailed plan versus the cursory plan or the framework is that with a detailed plan of questions, you might have, let's say, an Excel sheet or a Word document which has a table of all the questions broken down maybe by process, by person, etc., which is linked to paperwork. And what happens here is, as you speak to the person, while the interviewer asks the questions from this particular document, you'll have somebody taking notes against the respective questions. So it becomes a little easy for the person who's taking down the notes also, because they'll know which question you're asking, and they'll have the same sheet of paper or file with them, and they'll be able to document the responses easily. With a model or a framework of facts, you tend to keep the conversation flow a little bit more fluid. You don't write down the questions, but what you do is you create compartments for the various facts into different sections, and those responses could be written down. But here the conversation flow tends to be a little bit more fluid. Here, you at least have the basic set of questions in place so that you don't have to really think about which question needs to be asked when and so on. But I think this just boils down to each person's preference. Some people are more comfortable with creating the model or framework. Some people are more comfortable with a detailed plan of questions. So at the interview, a very good practice is to keep the entire meeting very comfortable and polite for the other person. It is a good practice to define the purpose of the interview. So we tell them upfront, we are here because we've done a review of XYZ. We were hired by the client for so and so. We are very clear with the purpose. We also tell them how long we think the interview would take. We also tell them what the arrangement for breaks are. Because I remember, these might seem very silly points, but I remember there was one interview where the person came in and then they immediately wanted to go out on a break. And we just had to say no. So you'll have to gauge again the body language of the person, try to see if they genuinely need a few minutes off. We do try to keep it polite, but at the same time, we need to control the flow of conversation and the time that is invested in the interview. It's also important to inform the other person why confidentiality matters. It is in the interest of all parties. We also try to limit interruptions like mobile phones or being called for any important meetings or anything of that sort. Again, the rapport differs a little bit between a witness and a suspect. With a witness, I know it's a lot easier. With a suspect, it might be a little harder, but I think the objectives of either of those interviews are more or less the same. But for the most part, we try to be as fair and transparent as possible. We avoid showing any judgment or emotion, regardless of what they have to share, because sometimes interviewees tend to break down. They will tend to cry and say, you know, I did nothing, but I'm willing to share. One interview was very easy. It was with the junior accountant. So even before we started, he completely broke down and he said, you know, I have done nothing wrong. I was asked to do a lot of things by my seniors, and we had to just put away our questions, etc., because he was fully forthcoming with information. So that was a very different flow. But when somebody shows emotion like that, we should also be prepared to handle that situation. And emotion could be not just about somebody being you know, upset or breaking down and sharing information with you. It could also be from an anger perspective. There was one interview where the person did try to get hostile, so they might get loud. But the idea is, with the flow of conversation, you can always limit the amount of emotion that comes out. With good planning, that always helps. We also try to avoid making assumptions. While we know the facts of the case, we are trying to get the other person to speak. So it's always good practice to avoid any assumptions. Now, usually with the documentation, what happens is the interviewers might be one or two. Even if there are two interviewers, we agree which is the person who's going to be asking the questions. The other person might play a role as an active listener and might probably suggest a few questions in between that can be asked by the first person. Active listening is very, very important because there are a lot of cues we can pick up, not just based on the words that are expressed, but also from body language, from tone, the pace of speech, etc. Recording of interviews should always be disclosed. So if you are going to undertake an audio or video recording of the interview legally, it has to be disclosed and we need to seek permission. That's not something many people will be comfortable with. So normally what we do is we have a third person who writes down the responses on paper or in the Excel file or the Word document, and we just tell the interviewee that for all the questions that are being asked, we'll make a note of the responses. And people usually are okay with that, as opposed to undertaking an audio or video recording of the interview itself. And as I've said before, it's a good practice to keep either printed or soft copies of evidence readily accessible. Now, at the interview, one of the crucial things is to control the conversation. While the questions are readily available, if the other person has, usually if it's a suspect and if he's somebody from senior management, he will come very well prepared to not share anything during the interview. And yet we have to structure our questions and control the conversation in a manner that we are able to seek the responses that we need. So a lot of body language plays a very crucial role here. We try to maintain eye contact. We must maintain eye contact ideally with the suspect. You have to demonstrate active listening through body language. There is a subtle element of control. So if the other person knows that they are in a place where they can take charge of the conversation, you'll usually know this in the first minute or so, and then the entire interview is lost. So here again, the planning part is very, very crucial, because if you have the set of questions well planned, then the control of the conversation will always remain with the investigator, with the person asking the questions. It's also very important to maintain focus of questions, because somebody who's trying to throw you off guard will always try to spend more time rambling, sharing additional information, and that's where we try to step in and politely limit any unnecessary conversation so that we can tell them, okay, you know, you've explained this, thank you very much, so we'll move to the next one. And that's how we can control the conversation. So while you might have certain aggressive interviewees, it's also very important to respect vulnerable interviewees. We had one case where the person walked in a little aggressively, but in the first 10 minutes, he knew it was a lost cause. So he just sort of eased up, and then he said, okay, I'm just going to share what transpired. And he was willing to give us all the evidence and information needed to conclude the case. So it is important to respect vulnerable interviewees. And what I mean by that is, while we do control the conversation, it should never become aggressive from our side. Since we are all in corporate investigations, or since most of us would be handling corporate projects, our type of interviews don't need that aggression. I think, I don't know, for certain other professions where interviews are used, maybe that does make a difference, but I hardly find the need in our type of work. It's also a good practice to summarize and conclude at the end of each question, so that our understanding of what they have shared is clear and it is the same. Another important aspect is to maintain or increase the cognitive load in the conversation, so that you limit the time that the interviewee gets to think. So if you spend too much time in between two questions looking for something or pausing, then you are giving the other person a little time to think and fabricate the truth. If there is an indication that the person is trying to bring an element of deceit, sometimes asking questions in the reverse order of facts also helps, because usually somebody who's trying to control the facts through deceit will have the order of the events in a certain manner. While we know what actually happened, when you try to mix up the order of facts, it mentally throws them a little off guard, and that will help you to check if how much of it is actually true and how much of it is false information. As much as possible, I think it is good to minimize the possibility of a hostile witness, which again goes back to having those primary objectives and secondary objectives. An interview, we shouldn't come out. So for me, I think the whole concept is, when you come out of an interview, you come out with all the information you need, or at least one step towards progressing the investigation to the next stage. It should never be a complete failure. When it is a complete failure, then we've sort of lost that game, and it becomes very difficult to call for another meeting. Now, another interesting part of interviews is comprehending language, which could be, of course, verbal. You know when someone is thought out in their responses. You know when someone is speaking in a very concise manner, that all of their responses are thought out. At the same time, with some people, you know if they are rambling, that they are trying to just sort of speak unnecessarily without giving or paying too much importance to facts. So you just need to be aware of the natural flow of conversation with the person and see, I think, gauge how the verbal language is going. There are also a lot of non-verbal cues to look into. Some of these could indicate that the suspect is trying to be a little deceptive during the interview. So if they fail to make eye contact, or let's say they're sweating profusely, or you can see them flush or blush. This is something we've noticed towards the fag end of the questions. As we reach some of those probing questions, we've seen that there are some senior people who come in extremely well prepared, and what happens towards the end is they tend to get a little flustered. So somewhere you will notice a shift in the body language, either in the gestures or facial expression, or grabbing additional glasses of water. It can be anything. So while that is not evidence per se for us, that will give you an indication as to how invested that person is in that conversation and what they're trying to share. How much can you ask them, or how much can you probe further to get to where you need to. Paralinguistic parts of the conversation also do play a role. Fluency in speech, is there a change in intonation? Suddenly is someone starting to speak louder, or are they is the tone changing? Is the speed changing? All of these are subtle cues that we can be aware of, which helps us to push a little further when we reach the probing question stage. So coming back to this funnel, what would happen is, initially, this is the part where we finish our initial introductions. We try to keep the environment comfortable. This is where there'll be a smooth flow of conversation between the interviewer and the interviewee. But as it comes down to the probing questions, this is where it tends to get a little difficult, and this is a stage ideally where the conversation has to be controlled really strongly by the interviewer without being rude or aggressive. But this is where keeping a cue on the body language, the paralinguistic cues that make a huge role. So depending on that, you can choose to what extent you need to probe further, or sometimes it could be a lot easier as well. It's also very important to analyze responses. Now, because the interviews are all verbal, people might say things, but they still have to be supported by evidence for us to be able to use it in an investigation. So when the person is speaking, we try to understand whether it's a first person account. We try to ask for evidence and say, okay, you have explained all this. Can you show us the paperwork that supports it? If it's hearsay, we take it with a pinch of salt, or we try to keep those notes down and then maybe ask another person who's part of the same hearsay. You also have to be aware of any denial, any exaggeration of facts, and also be aware, while we are aware of the facts, the other person will not know how much we are aware of. So out of, let's say, the events they're talking only about 20% of it, there is an element of them not being upfront with disclosing certain facts, and that will give you again certain cues to structure the questions as you move on. So I have an example of a good interview and a bad interview. And unfortunately, this is on a webinar. Otherwise, this is quite interesting to do when it's in the form of a case where two people are able to enact it. But in any case, I just thought I'd put this in an Excel sheet so that I could explain how different a bad interview is from a good interview. So in this case of the bad interview, let's say the investigator had not been very well prepared, and you can see from the flow of conversation how they completely lost track of the objective. Now, the entire objective was to find out if certain unapproved payments went towards we're just trying to understand the purpose of certain unapproved payments. So initially, the investigator completes the introduction, and the client says, I'm XYZ, and he says, I've been working as the finance director for 5 years in this company. And this person says, we've been appointed to do a review of certain vendor payments or transactions. So the finance director, you can see the second question is, he throws it against the investigator or the auditor and says, how did the internal audit go? What points do you have for me? So this person says, yes, we have some observations and we have reviewed the payments. So you can see right here that the finance director has actually taken charge of the conversation, and the investigator or the interviewer is falling in line with this flow. So at this point itself, it's very easy to see how badly the rest of it would go for the interviewer. So at this stage, the finance director says, yes, go on, probes a little further. And the interviewer says, okay, can you tell me why you have made payments to ABC agency for 3 lakhs without the signature of the PR manager? And the finance director says, I do not know, have you asked her? And the interviewer says, yes. She says that she's not aware of the other invoices. Now, the finance director, being a senior person, of course, he says, how is that possible? She is the head of PR. She's been appointed to do that, so how can she not be aware? The person then says, okay, so why was the payment made then? The finance director says, you should ask her who has signed on the invoice. And then he says the finance manager has approved it. The director of finance says, have you asked him? And the interviewer says no. And then the director says, what is your observation then? The interviewer then says, no, I see that the issue is payment without Anita's approval. And the finance director says, I do not see that as an issue at all. And then you say she should have signed it, plus she does not have videos or photos of the event either. And the director says, okay, we have many events. Does she have photos for all? At this stage, I think the interviewer realizes that the meeting is almost lost and says, okay, why don't you tell me? The person says, the finance director then says, I agree, but this is a control weakness and I will look into it. Now, what happens at the end of this very critical meeting is that this could have been a trigger for maybe an inappropriate payment. And the objective of this interview is completely lost because it's been whittled down to a control weakness. And the losing point was literally here when the person asked this question and the interviewer just decided to go with the same flow. So this is an example of a bad interview. So a good interview would be structured a little differently. And we've colored these different sections just to understand the funnel of questioning. So initially, the questions that are just a generic introduction saying, you know, hi, I'm so and so. I've been appointed by the CFO to conduct a review of vendor transactions. Are you comfortable? Would you like some tea, coffee, water, etc.? And then say, you know, we will be taking notes of this meeting for working papers, and then introduce the other interviewer, introduce the person taking the notes. So keep the conversation flow a little easy so that the other person's also a bit more comfortable. And then we start with very generic questions like, can you explain your roles and responsibilities? So the finance director in the same situation explains that he's been working with the company for 5 years, and then he or she explains his experience with large corporates for 20 years. This is based on an actual case. So usually what happens is this is where the interviewee tends to take a lot of time. They go overboard talking about how much work they've done, what they've done for the company, and so on and so forth. So that's where you'll have to sort of step in, and the person says, all right, thank you for that. Keep the conversation focused and come down to the process. So the first set of questions are all around the general process, like what is the process for vendor selection? What is the process for payment approvals? How do you check if a vendor has performed his work? And the finance director would or has responded to all those questions briefly. Then you come down to the specific case and say, and even then it's still kept at a wider level and say, specifically, can you explain how you chose ABC agency? And very easily the finance director says it's owned by a distant relative of mine. He does very good work, so we decided to work with them. And then the same set of questions are asked, but with regard to that particular agency, and say, what was the process of approving payments to that agency? So, and they say that's the usual process as explained before. Can you explain it again? This is where we say, okay, I would like to know what was employed for this particular agency? What was the process here? This is where we noticed a subtle shift in the body language, and they still explain what is needed to. You push them and say, who is the user department here? You know, could you go on? Slightly probing questions. How does she know that the work is finished? And then they share that information. And then you say, okay, I'm keen on understanding the process. Can there be a situation where photos and videos may not be received? Which is the exact opposite of the last, the bad interview, where the question was flipped in a different manner. So when you are asking this question, the person says, ideally, that should not be the scenario, but I would not know. The next set of questions becomes a bit more specific, and then we say, okay, sure. We noticed about 10 of the 20 invoices approved by you for which there were no photos or videos. Can you explain the purpose of these payments? The finance director says, have you asked the PR head? And the interviewer says, no, she's not aware of these. And one of the junior team members does not have copies either. So what happened there? And the person says, I do not know. So that's when you tend to push a little. And here again, it depends on what cues you get from the body language or those non-verbal cues. It says, as a finance director, you put the onus on the person and say it is your duty to be aware. So why did you then sign these checks? There could be a blank response. And then you say, okay, let me be honest. We need your support in resolving this. So would you be willing to share some information as to what actually happened. So, and then the person says, I don't know how to explain this. I was only informed that we had to create a fund so that an appropriate payment could be made. And I was asked by the head office to do so and so. I did not speak to the vendor. I only have a certain set of details. So we say, okay, thank you. We'll give you some more time, but could you consider, thinking over the transaction and providing more details subsequently? So the person said yes, and they came back with more evidence which supported the objective of this entire meeting. Now, the meeting objective ideally was to understand what was the underlying reason of these certain payments which went through a very different level of approvals or went without the approvals of the PR head. So the reality of this case was that I think they were trying to create a sort of a fund which enabled them to make certain bribes to government officials for the sake of statutory non-compliances. So this is an example of how a good interview can flow and how a bad interview can go from identifying something much larger to being reduced to almost a control weakness. Now, in conclusion, a lot of these techniques can be used. Invariably, we end up using it, I think, even in everyday life, because it makes us a little bit more aware of our thoughts and the words we use to convey them. I've learned two things from investigative interviews. One is we always have to listen to what the other person is saying and understand the intent with which they are asking certain questions. Now, while the person is free to ask anything, the information is within us and we need to decide how much we have to share. And the reverse of it is also true, because when we are doing an interview, we are at a place where we ask any set of questions limited to the facts. And if the other person is well prepared, then the answers they provide are going to be more controlled. So some of these things I know personally also help. It helps from, again, a business perspective, personal perspective. It helps us, for me, it has really helped to sort of actively listen to what another person is saying and also decide how much information needs to be shared vis-a-vis what we already are aware of or what knowledge is, within us. So it really helps to control a conversation. A lot of these techniques, I don't think, are just limited to investigations alone. Interestingly, if you look at some of these journalist interviews also, while some of them are, of course, shouting matches, I think some of the more interesting interviews with, senior politicians or senior business people, the way the questions are structured and how much they get to to enable the other person to open up, those are also very, very interesting. At the end of it, I just think it comes down to how the questions are being structured and being able to listen to the other person in a very objective manner. So that's all I have for today. If you have, any questions, then I think we can put that in the chat box.
We have some questions. So first question is we have from Mr. Uma Mageshwaran. So he asks, I have performed internal audits with intermittent fraud investigations wherever the need arose. In my experience, I found investigations as emotionally taxing. Internal audits were not so. How to manage this part and enjoy being a full-time investigator?
It is very taxing. I don't know how to handle it, but what I normally do is I don't do investigations full time, so I still do investigations only when it comes through referral, while my other work is also on GRC and analytics, etc. But what I do during an investigation is I cut off from everyone if it's possible. Limit conversation with family, friends. That's how I handle it. So if I'm there for about a week or 2 weeks, then I'm 100% there. Otherwise, it is mentally very, very taxing. Another way I have found it easier, I think, on at least on the thinking part, is I have these big, if this helps, I have these big chart paper books with me, which I'll carry. Keep it in, the hotel room or back home. And every day when I come back, all the thoughts in my head after reviewing the paperwork, I put it down loosely. And it's very interesting because somewhere you'll see a link between all of those. Because sometimes while we only review the documents, the person who's done the fraud would have had a certain process to it. That process could be based on timelines, it could be based on groups of people, or it could even be based on a certain process or flow. So I find that putting those little, things which are in my head in a big chart paper at the end of every day also helps, because it's almost like a jigsaw puzzle coming together. But it is emotionally taxing, and that's the reason why I actually limit conversation with family and friends, except to tell them that I'm okay, I've had breakfast, lunch, dinner, nothing more than that.
Okay. He has another question. Apart from CFP certification, are there any globally recognized certifications for fraud investigation?
I know the CA Institute has a course on forensics. Apart from that, I'm not aware. I'm also not sure if certification makes a difference, because I'm not a CFE either. And I know a lot of investigators who are not chartered accountants. So there are people from different backgrounds who are, I think it's only about how willing we are to dig deep as opposed to going wide. But I'm not aware of other global certifications in Saudi.
Okay, he has another question. In the given current context, are there any specific tips for virtual investigations with travel being restricted?
It is a little difficult, but I think the biggest problem is that the body language element is completely lost. So if you are going to do it, I think it might be a good practice to at least have the video on, or do it with a webcam on. I still feel some of it might be lost, but under these circumstances, I think at least doing a video and audio call might help as to doing just an audio call.
Okay. Hope that answers his questions. Next, we have Mr. Sunil Verma. His question is, if a person got himself locked into the room on pretext of break and tried for suicidal attempt, what should the team do?
Okay, thankfully, I've never come across such a situation, but I think, again, as the interview progresses, I think if you know that the person is not able to handle it, whether it is from an anger perspective or breaking down completely, I think it's best to just stop the investigation, because there's no other way of going about it. If somebody is, even when someone is let's say crying, or if they are being temperamental, or they are yelling and shouting, it's best to just stop the investigation, because there's no point taking a chance on either our lives or that person's lives and deal with an unpleasant situation. We also try to limit breaks, which is why we tell the person upfront that this meeting is going to be for 1.5 hours. If you need to use the washroom, then please go before, not during. So we don't let them take that break in between.
Okay. Yes. So we have next question from Mr. Virat. How do you deal with a hostile interview? If you have a hostile interview, he's asking any special tips you can give on dealing with them.
Okay. There was this one interview where upfront we knew it was going to be very hostile. The key thing over there was I traveled to the city where the person was. We chose a hotel very close to the airport so that they don't know where you are coming from or who you are. And I very rarely communicate on phone or email with a witness or a suspect. If it's a hostile interview, I'll always ask the client to send out the email and the client to speak and say, you need to be at XYZ place at so and so time. As an interviewer, I never take that responsibility on myself to communicate directly with the suspect. But again, I think having that primary objective and secondary objective is crucial. This one case where we all were aware that the suspect would become hostile. In the initial stages itself, the questions were, it just sort of went off the way we had structured it. And while we tried to control the conversation, we knew it would become very hostile if we probed for the first objective, which is why we dropped that. And then we said, okay, if you're not willing to talk to us, will you at least be willing to share so and so information with, the senior management? So that I found practically was a good way of handling it, because if it had turned hostile, and I genuinely felt that if I had kept pushing that person, he would have shut off and he would have refused to talk to the COO at the client's location. So when I knew that I could not push this person beyond a certain point, I just stepped back and said, okay, if you're not willing to share it with me, this is all that is there and we need to conclude this. Will you at least say yes to talking to the CEO? So he agreed, and that meeting was set up, and the investigation still progressed.
Okay.
But I think a lot of this is also, I don't know, I think sometimes we just have to think on our feet, be a little practical, because like when we knew this interview was going to turn hostile, quite frankly, even I wasn't sure how it would run. We didn't know how successful it would be.
Yes. We will go to the next question. The next question is from Mr. Singh Rajput. He asked, are there any restrictions on information that we can ask? Can we ask for data like bank statements, income details, etc. during our interrogation?
You can ask for information, and as long as it's given voluntarily, there is no issue with it. I also know that the type of questions will change depending on whether the client wishes to go legal or not. In India, there are very few clients who actually choose to go legal at the end of an investigation. So assuming that part is kept out, and if the idea is just to find out the damage and to ascertain who has done what, when, where, why, etc., I don't think there is a limit on the questions as long as it is within the facts of the case and it is to aid the end objective of the investigation.
Okay. And he asked, does aggregation necessarily mean that the person is a wrongdoer?
I don't know, because so honestly, I don't know. I think in my experience, I've met different sets of people. So there was this one person who was highly qualified. He got a little aggressive or little temperamental during the interview because he just felt very insulted that he was a person of, of standing, and he'd come from a highly educated background, and he was just very upset that he was put in a place of being questioned. Although he did share the information towards the end, he was not even a suspect, he was just a witness. So there was another case wherein the person who was, I think he held a doctorate, etc., and he was the person who was heading this at a country level, very calm and cool throughout the questioning, but only towards the end he started to become a little flustered. So aggression, I feel you'll have to, I think it depends on whether the person is a witness or suspect. Maybe depending on the stage of questioning, you'll have to gauge the intent, if that makes sense. Like someone who's aggressive initially and who's a witness, maybe I think setting up that comfortable environment might help them to calm down a little. If it's from a suspect perspective, then maybe there is an element of deceit or they're trying to fabricate some of the truth.
Yeah, the next question is actually regarding that. Is it always necessary to inform the suspect from the agenda? Like, is it always necessary to inform the suspect the agenda of the interview, since this will give enough time for him to prepare the responses? This is a question from Mr. Meeraj Kodwal.
Okay, so when we do the planning initially, so let's say hypothetically the interviews are scheduled for a Monday. it is usually on a Saturday that I'd ask the client to send out just an email or a phone call saying you need to be at XYZ place at so and so time, and we'll organize transport for you, just to discuss certain issues. That's all we'd say. The introduction by the interviewer happens during the meeting. But in any case, I think most people would come planned for these sessions. But the initial, I always think it's good to keep it fair and transparent, because it is only when we try to be, or when we try to cover up what our objective or intent is, that we let the other person also tend to see. At the end of the day, I mean, I'm not judging as to who is, good or bad, but I feel if we go from an honest and clean approach, you make the other person more comfortable, and then we are in a cleaner playground to gauge whether that person is being deceitful or not. So if it's a person who is genuine, then they will open up. On the other hand, if we try to cover up our genuine, what our intent is, I feel then you don't know how forthcoming the other person is going to be, because they might also catch the same cue. So the best practice I know is to always keep it fair, transparent, and polite.
Yes. So the next question is from Mr. Dilip. He asks how to deal with queries not resolved during interview. So in our investigation, if you're not able to identify some aspects, how do we take it and close it in our assignment?
Assuming that if the interview was well planned and still we did not get any information out of it, then the only way to, sometimes it might be difficult to resolve it. So in which case, what we do is in the report, we'll say, okay, these are the facts of the case. And when we did the interviews, we're able to back it with the set of questions we asked. We can always say that the responses were evasive, or the person denied or accepted. So this is where I think those concluding questions also come into play, because at the end of, for every interview notes, there has to be a concluding note that the investigator adds. And if the person was being evasive, then you would know from the language. Like the first case of bad interview, the person was being evasive to a certain extent by saying, I wouldn't know, I'm the finance director, so I really wouldn't know, have you asked the other person? So the conclusion there is that the person is being evasive. So you may not be able to resolve it or get the extra evidence sometimes, but I think from a report perspective, that's how I've handled it.
Okay. So next we have a question from Mr. Azam Ali. Although investigation is not the primary job of an internal auditor, but in some cases, if it is needed to do an interview, how the internal auditor can prepare for it?
I would think in the exact same manner, because the key thing is just in the planning stage. So over here, for instance, I'm assuming in this case, the internal audit report would be there, or the facts from the internal audit would be there. So the same techniques for drafting, same techniques for planning can be used even by an internal auditor. I don't think this is something which is specific only for investigations.
Okay. So next question we have from Mr. Sivakumar. What is the technique to get protection against defamation by the interviewer?
I'm sorry?
What is the technique to get protection against defamation by the interviewee? I think he's meaning that without defamation of the interviewee, how we can conduct the interview. So that is if he is going to put a defamation suit against us just for conducting the information.
No, which is why the initial representation is very important. I'm not sure where I put that. So here, this initial representation, I think this goes back to one of the other questions also being asked. If we are open and upfront as to why we are there, who appointed us, and the purpose of it, then this becomes easy. Of course, the person has a right, the interviewee always has a right to seek to have a lawyer present there. So if they say, okay, after coming there, if that person says, I need a lawyer only, then I'm going to take or participate in this, then you just have to stop. And they are legally allowed to have that person. But that's why I also said, recording the interview, doing an audio or video recording of the interview without disclosing to the other person. All these are things that, as an investigator, we should avoid, because these are grounds where where we are more open to a defamation case. The kind of questions we ask are also important. That's why we say, try to be fair, transparent, polite. If it goes a little over and above what we can handle, then it's best to just
Yeah, we
put
have
it
two
on
more
hold.
questions on the same regard, whether formal interview alone can get the results without touching the emotions of the interviewee. Then, in the absence of recording, how important it is to get a signed minutes of meeting with the suspect. In addition, what if the suspect does not accept any of the discussed or agreed upon facts posted in the interview? Like post the interview. If he's going to disagree for the facts post interview, how are we going to do without a minutes of meeting signed by him or recordings?
Okay, so if you don't have an audio or a video recording, what we normally do is we take down the notes in front of the person, depending the level of evidence that they have or are willing to share. We'll ask them to give us a written statement across the table and say, okay, why don't you write this down, sign it and give it to us. If not, we'll take the notes and we'll send you the minutes immediately after, so that you can come back and conclude it. So that's one part of it. If the person is willing to share evidence or willing to go on record, evidence need not just be on paper, but if they are willing to go on record and say, I was asked to do this by person XYZ, and I will provide necessary facts to support my claim, something of that sort, it is a good practice to get that written and signed by the person. All minutes, ideally, we would get it confirmed by the interviewee as well. So that's one part of the question.
Yes. So, and the other part of the question was whether formal interview will be as successful than interrogation, without touching emotions, without going for more detailed steps. Whether formal interview will be able to get the same results using these techniques.
Well, I mean, these are also formal interviews. I don't think these are, see, again, because most of our work is around the corporate side, these are formal interviews. So while we may call it an interrogation or an interview, I think it's more or less the same. I'm not sure if it's possible to avoid the emotional aspects of it, but from an investigation perspective, I know there's going to be no aggression or torture being employed, which could be there for certain other cases. For instance, if you're interviewing a terrorist, I know that it's a whole different ball game. If it's from a military or police perspective, it is very different. We are still in a corporate environment where we are bound by legal norms, so on and so forth, and structuring it in the same formal manner, I think is the safest and the best for all parties concerned.
Okay, I think you answered his next question. His next question is exact difference between interview and interrogation. So we'll go to the next question. So there, they thank you for the amazing session. Would it be possible to join as an article assistant in forensic department of a audit firm? Do firms encourage freshers for such forensic audit trials?
I think now it is possible. So maybe if you need some help, maybe you can just send me an email and I'll try connecting you to someone. That's all I can say.
Sure, you can connect Harshini. So next question is from Shivakumar. Today, the banks expect decision of fraud or not by the forensic auditor within a time limit. If decision could not be taken, how to conclude?
I'm
So
sorry.
time-bound assignments. So he's asking in time-bound assignments in forensic audit, how we have to conclude the report? Because he's telling there's not much time given by banks to decide whether the case is fraud or not. So how we have to conclude the report if we are not able to take the decision?
I mean, every investigation is time bound, and I know it's not easy, but it is a very important leg, I feel, is the interviews also. So even if the report is not completely ready, even if the written report is not ready, at least with the facts, if we can quickly from at least complete the planning with the list of questions. And this is where I think maybe the framework type of this second way of planning might probably take less time than the detailed plan of questions. So maybe you can put in the model or framework, but I think an interview does help to tie up those loose ends. Every investigation is time bound. And without it, it is a little difficult to conclude.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's applicable equally for all assignments. Yes. So next we have a question from Mr. Bikram. If we found that the person to whom we are going to interview is a senior employee and have a great position and knowledge, what kind of preparation we need to do?
Okay. So the key thing from my experience is usually people who are at senior management, and let's say they are at that suspect level, they'll come very, very well prepared for the interview. So after most of those cases, I undertake a detailed plan of the questions, and I sit down and brainstorm with the client also, just to understand the psyche or how that person is. Understanding the personality traits of that person, we try to brainstorm and say, okay, for this particular question, what if this person responds with A, B, C? How do we then? So we try to rework on some of these questions after the brainstorming session. So I feel that the brainstorming session with the client really, really helps, because it helps us to understand some of those personality traits and be better prepared. But again, I think that's where a lot of focus and active listening plays a role, because if we are able to control that conversation, even if it's somebody who's from a senior management, then the success of the interview is a little better. But I've personally found that specifically for those cases, always having a discussion with somebody from the client side always makes a difference.
Sorry, Smriti, I have been speaking on mute. The next question for the day we have from Mr. Raj Srivatsa. Oh, sorry. Yes. What are the key skills that the person conducting an interview should mandatorily have?
I don't know about skill sets per se, but I think the main thing is to plan the questions well, so that two things happen. So when we are at the interview, it's mentally a very, very intense process. So having the questions on hand puts your brain at ease, at least as far as the framework of the interview goes. So while that part of it is outside and you know it's taken care of, active listening is very, very crucial, because what happens as the interview progresses is very rarely will, let's say we have 20 questions as per our list, very rarely will we stick to those 20 questions. So if you need to restructure something in between or ask something else, then paying attention to what the interviewee is saying, being very clearly aware of the facts that we have, and restructuring or reframing some of those questions so that the flow of conversation is maintained, I think is very important. Because while the person keeps responding, regardless of what he or she says, if we say, okay, question 1 is over, let me go to question 2, then the flow of conversation is lost. If we can put ourselves in the place of the interviewee, it's a very, I think it's going to be way more taxing on them, because they don't know what is coming their way. They would probably be well planned to a certain extent, but keeping that conversation flow, I think, is very important. I'm not sure what other skill sets are.
Yeah, the next question is also on similar lines from Mr. Satyananda Prabhu. During the course of investigation, if you feel the direction of investigation is not on the planned lines, how do you handle it? So is there any skills which we have to use there?
I'm sorry, if
during the course of investigation, if you feel the direction of investigation is not on the planned lines, how do you handle it? Okay. So I think from your previous answer of the keen listening and how.
The interview or the investigation?
Investigation.
Okay, so okay, oh yes, this is it is very, very stressful because this has happened once or twice. In spite of planning very carefully, if the investigation doesn't go the way we intended to, I know it is like looking, it's almost like searching for a needle in a haystack. I think the last time this happened was it started getting very desperate because in the first week we found absolutely no evidence, and while the work plan was getting ticked off, we were not getting anywhere close to where we needed to be. As funny, or I don't know, I think I literally prayed one Sunday morning and I went to the client's place, but what really helped was to keep my eyes open to certain visual cues and to also understand how. So sometimes it's not always what is on paper. Understanding what groups of people are friends. Here in this particular case, I remember the suspect was the accountant, and I was asking him to recommend certain people under different divisions to meet. So he was referring people he was friends with, and those groups of friends were also, I understood they were traveling together. When we did the transaction review, I think we took a step aside that day and we said, okay, let's look at this from a person perspective or a date perspective. So that document flow sometimes does not help. So what I found is if it doesn't work when we stick to plan, I think it's important to just sort of take a step back and look at something further. What finally clicked in one particular case was actually looking at, we found one evidence on a cash register, and we found just one page where there was something that we suspected. We went back and we did analytics to see different types of duplicate payments that could be made. And again, it was based on those same groups of people who were traveling. This travel plan we saw from a whiteboard. So I know these are different data points which connect, but I think what I'm trying to say is if it doesn't go as per plan, it's maybe it's a good practice to just sort of look beyond the paperwork or the documentation and look at it maybe from a date perspective or event perspective or groups of people perspective. I'm not sure if that helps. I think some of those have helped me, some of these techniques.
Okay. So we have two more questions. So this is from Mr. Hassan Ali. In some cases, suspects will come with the aggregation and he won't be answering properly. How to handle this kind of persons?
So I think this again, this goes back to that good interview versus bad interview case. If somebody is being aggressive, then if we have the set of questions planned, it's good to stick to that plan, but again, have that primary objective and secondary objective. If that aggression is going to turn, let's say, physical or violent, it's just best to terminate the interview and then inform the client immediately.
Okay.
I was taught one thing is we should never try to be heroes when we're doing an investigation and put our lives at risk. So I still believe in that. If it becomes extremely aggressive, then it's best to step back. But if it's just, you know, if you can make out that someone is being, in a very normal course of conversation, if they are being aggressive, then I think those we can definitely control through conversation. Keep in mind that if that primary objective is not met, I can at least get to the secondary objective so that all is not lost.
Yes. So I think we have already answered the question about how to handle interviews with top management and very senior people. So we'll move on to the next question. Do we also interrogate a person who tipped us for the fraud? Tipped us off the fraud? Did you come across cases where tipper was the actual culprit? Do we also interrogate the person who tipped us for the fraud? Did
Yes,
you come across any cases?
yes. So the whistleblower is, so I think this was at the initial stage of investigation. If it is a whistleblower, this is a person we would ideally meet before the investigation, sometimes during and sometimes even at the final stages. I know in theory it is possible that the whistleblower can also be the suspect. Fortunately or unfortunately, in the work I have done, I've never come across where the whistleblower is also the suspect. But these interviews tend to be less, what do I say, difficult or complex. This we do at different stages. I know we've handled whistleblower questions or sorry, the interviews in the beginning, during, and even at the final stages. But I'm sorry, I've never had the experience where the same person is the suspect.
Okay, thank you, Smriti. Thank you very much for answering all the questions so patiently. I think we have come to end of the question answer session. So I will propose the vote of thanks now, and we are also closing nearly to our closing time. So I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Ms. Smriti Chandrasekharan for giving an excellent coverage on various interviewing techniques, investigation questionnaires, and other methods for managing and controlling communication during investigations. Lucid language and the pace kept the audience engaging till the end. Thank you, Smriti, very much. So the illustrations which you gave about the good and bad interview, the body language which we have to follow during the investigation, decrypting different aspects of the investigation was well covered by you. I'm sure all the audience would have been definitely benefited with this session. Thank you very much. Thank you behalf of all the participants and behalf of IIM Madras chapter and Women's Forum. So thank you audience for staying with us till the end. We look forward for your active participation in our upcoming events also. We will be hosting our next session, which will be a quiz during the second week of December. We'll keep you posted. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Once again, thank you very much, Smriti. We are getting a lot of thank you messages and applause for your presentation today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Deepak, and thank you to Uma ma'am also. I think in spite of the hiccups today, we still went ahead. So thank you so much for being understanding and being a little accommodating on that front. With interviews, there's always a learning. So I think with some of the questions also, it's made me think back a little bit to see how maybe some things can be handled a little better. Yes, my pleasure. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us today.